Hello, thank you. I'm very excited to be here today and to talk about this. So I guess I shall get started. All right. So as he said, I'm Ryan Carniato. I'm the creator of the JavaScript framework SolidJS. And today we're going to look at a recently beta released meta framework, SolidStart. SolidStart is kind of the equivalent to things like SvelteKit or Remix, Nuxt, or Next.js. It's a more opinionated framework to make it easier to do server-rendered applications with Solid, really to make it easier to make any sort of application with Solid. Today isn't going to be an introduction to SolidJS, though, but it does build on my learnings from working on it for the past 6 years. If you aren't super familiar with SolidJS, that's okay. All you need to know is that it introduces using reactive primitives to rethink the component model, popularized widely by React, and kind of dominates most frameworks in the ecosystem in the last decade or so. The key takeaway is that for all the good component architectures abroad, and I mean they are everywhere in modern front-end development, we've conflated code organization with execution lifecycles. In pretty much every framework, components have runtime considerations. They are primary state, our renderer, really are everything. And that isn't limited to the virtual DOM. It's true for compiled solutions as non-compiled, tag template literals, to virtual DOMs, single file components, to the hottest DSLs, everything kind of running top down. And I get there's a bit of like, who cares? But it informs every subsequent question, like what do I memoize? When do I memoize? What do I use for global state? How do I share reactivity between files? When to use effect? What's the difference between Redux and context? Why does this log twice? Why does this stupid thing keep re-rendering? These are topics that dominate the conversation, and really I'd rather be talking about pretty much anything else. There are a lot of things that are just unlocked when you change your perspective a little bit. Now, I could wax poetic about the power of reactivity. I could go on about how it's declarative and composable, how it helps produce well-structured code that's reusable, independent of any component system. And even how with a few basic primitives, you can do everything you could ever wish for, including rendering. And with performance we haven't seen since hand-optimized vanilla JavaScript. That's SolidJS, but that's not really why I'm here. There's a different recalibration going on, and that is around the role of the browser and the server and how we build applications. To appreciate this, we need to look back at our history. From my perspective, the history of web development has been a game of hot potato to see who's left holding the state. The web started on the back end. We served static HTML files from file server on request. Soon these pages became more dynamic and generated via code on these requests. And state was owned by the server. Change a piece of UI, the whole page reloads. These days, we call this approach multi-page apps, or MPA for short. But nothing's more distinctive to me of this time than going to a travel booking site, going through some cascading dropdowns. You choose your country, reload. Select the city, reload. Choose your dates, reload, and so on. But that wasn't really the only thing. As our apps got more interactive and JavaScript grew, we started seeing a lot of duplication between backend and front end, which are typically written in different languages. I'm talking about things like templating, business logic, and UI state. I don't know how many of you had the pleasure of layering your front-end logic on top of Ruby's ERB templates, but I have. Here's a little knockout.js on top of ERB. You can see the duplication. And honestly, this approach is still around today in form of things like Alpine.js and Petite Vue. Now, using knockout instead of jQuery in the last example may have been jumping ahead a bit, but the real unlock we saw was around 2010. In the wake of Ajax making to the browser back in 2005 and the browser engines drastically improving JavaScript performance, more sophisticated JavaScript frameworks appeared, making it feasible to build complete applications in the browser, well, with an API. In many ways, this was a drastic simplification. Client-owned state communicates with a stateless backend. We could author UIs in a single code base. But there was a problem. Wait for it. Okay, I'm kidding. This was the problem. Being rendered in the browser meant we loaded blank pages, then loaded JavaScript, then rendered the page as we fetched the data. That all happened after the JavaScript was loaded. This is mostly fine for apps, but with a burst of popularity, things like React, we want to bring that developer experience to a wider range of sites. So, let's server render it initially, get the fast page load and the benefits of our single page app. And that basically brings us to today. Next.js, Nux, Velkit, Remix, like I've already mentioned. For the most part, the authoring experience stays the same as it did with client rendering, but now everything is isomorphic. It runs both in the browser and the server. And this has largely been seen as the pinnacle of web dev for the past 7 to 8 years. However, during the same period, I'd be remiss not to mention a different model developed. And that was kind of pioneered by eBay's Marco framework as early as 2014. And popularized more recently by things like Astro. Islands or partial hydration are an updated take on the multi-page app that have emerged. The concept is simple. Author declarative JavaScript code, and through the identification of specific components that are interactive, we can only send those to the browser. The key is that since these pages are always server rendered, we never need the JavaScript for the components that don't need to update. The benefit is that we return to web pages starting at 0 kilobytes of JavaScript baseline and growing as needed while retaining our declarative views and single language mindset. The negative is we are back to full page reloads, and most frameworks don't have a means to support this today. So why does this matter? Well, even the server render page time it takes to become interactive isn't free, right? We still need to fetch and start the JavaScript in the browser. As it turns out, not everyone enjoys this gigabit internet that I have here sitting in San Jose, and not everyone's running their site on the latest MacBook Pro. The truth is, the numbers I'm showing on the screen are from 2017, and things have only grown since then. I'm sure what you're thinking is, aren't there ways to address this? What about code splitting? What about streaming responses? The latter actually probably helps MPAs more than SPAs, as now they can respond immediately on navigation instead of waiting for data while still giving nice load indicator feel. What about progressive enhancement? What about using smaller or faster JavaScript libraries? What about you just do it all, put that all together? Yeah, that does solve some stuff, but it doesn't completely solve the problem. What we're dealing with here, for anyone who has stared at the problem long enough, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. What can be sent to the browser shall be sent to the browser. That's the adjustment we need to think about. So we have two solutions that benefit over each other, but don't do everything we want in one package. Do we go with the better page load at the cost of future navigation, or do we go with our slower loading isomorphic approaches that feel more app-like after initial load? Can we somehow do both? Does that even make sense? What I've actually noticed is server and client-centric approaches almost mirror each other. In a client-centric approach, the vast majority of your app is believed to be isomorphic, and we define patterns to denote things like that are only server only, things like get server-side props or loaders. In a server-centric approach, like islands, we do the opposite and denote the code that is required to be ran on the client to be interactive. Each starts with a different base assumptions and comes at the problem from the opposite sides. So let's use that to start a conversation about SolidStart and look at how we can build the client-centric isomorphic side. SolidStart is very much, as I said, categorized with Remix and SvelteKit and offering an approachable experience to building that provides you with all the tools you need to load and mutate data in your JavaScript applications. Of course, we do this in a very solid way. If you already use Solid, what you'll find is that we aren't introducing a new router or new libraries. It's all the ones already in the ecosystem. We are building upon what's already there and providing tools that can help every library in our ecosystem feel like it's first party. As you can imagine, that means this is all about primitives. We want things like get server-side props in Next or loaders like Remix, but we didn't want to compromise. And we want to keep the benefits we have come to desire from being modular and composable. The pattern in Solid for the past several years has been to define data functions that attach to each nested route section, and it runs in parallel to code splitting while setting up our resources for data fetching. It doesn't care whether it's on the server or the browser, it runs the same way. If left alone, it will fetch on the server during initial SSR and then on the browser on subsequent navigation. And that's what we have here. We're exporting this route data function. It creates a resource, which is basically a reactive primitive that will fetch the data from that URL and put it in our story signal. But what if I want to always fetch on the server? Well, we had an idea. What if any function could be ran on the server? Right? We immediately saw that this meant we could preserve types across the boundary, and this is really quite nice. all we'd have to do is wrap it in the server function. And this way we could tell the library that, hey, the code inside this function always runs on the server. And the thing is, if you still want a URL, well, it's available still as a property on that function. So we've used this, to design interesting APIs. We've used this with WebSockets or server sent events. But the takeaway is suddenly we had a primitive to do network communication in a type-safe way. So it turns out we can just plug this into our resource, and well, suddenly we have a function that always runs on the server. See, server fetch story. Now that could hit the database directly. And, we can write a wrapper to clean it up a bit, and, we're in business. Well, a little bulkier than maybe a simple async function, we get to have the cool things like invalidation by key. So we can granular invalidate these things the same way we would in libraries like TanStack Query. And speaking of TanStack Query, the community has already jumped into using our primitives. Solid's port of TanStack Query uses our resources under the hood, which means suspense, streaming, hydration, and even server functions all just work out of the box with zero configuration. Picture just dropping a query call and querying your database right in your component. That's what you can do with this approach. But, there's the mutation side of the equation. On the other side, we have actions. They can be defined in any JavaScript file, and they allow us to track progress of mutations and manage optimistic updates. By default, they'll refresh the data for the current route, but they can also granularly trigger invalidation on key. And did I mention they export progressively enhanced forms that work with no JavaScript? See? This all just piles on top of each other. You can define as many of these actions as you'd want in a file as they're just server functions, and don't feel that restriction of having to adhere to a file-based API for local mutations or worrying about over-refetching on invalidation. We kind of took a lot of the ideas that have come up with loaders and actions and data fetching and kind of and some inspiration from things like GraphQL, kind of separating the concept of mutations as RPCs versus loaders being kind of like the graph or the page structure. But let me show you an example of this in action. I've remade our classic to-do MVC, and this is a very simple example. It is just all in one file, just for our sake here, because it's funny. The simple examples are almost always they're reused over time for a reason. They kind of handle a lot of really basic use cases. So I'm just gonna fire this up here so we can see this. I'm gonna be using not dev mode mostly today because I want to focus on size and performance. But let me see if I can get to do MVT. So do excuse me if there's sometimes longer build times. But here we go. This is a SolidStart app. We have our root where we kind of come in, kind of set up, with a HTML structure, suspense, boundaries, routes, and then there's a file routes that indicates this is where in the route structure you want to inject the file system running. You could always just not use the file system running. I just wanted to kind of show this. And in our routes folder, our main index here is just our to-do app. We're exporting a route data, and as I showed before, it's just a server data that calls our database to-dos with an initial value here, right? So it just sets an empty list while suspense is loading. But generally speaking, we've defined our data. And then when we go into our to-do app, we use route data to get the set of to-dos. We use the location to get the location from the router. And then what you're going to see here is a bunch of these server actions. And these are all just the typical verbs, you see when doing a create to-do, a to-do MVC app, adding to-do, removing to-do, toggling to-dos. And we've used those actions both to do calculations like the remaining count, where we use them to looking at the pending to show optimistic updates. And they also are used as forms. So here we wrap a few inputs, maybe a hidden input to pass, some special information through, but essentially this is made off a bunch of forms that are exported from those actions. And in fact, we even can nest actions. Inside each list item, we also have actions for toggling the to-dos and editing them, and how to show the pending state. What do I mean by pending state? Let me show you. Here's our to-do MVC application, okay? And this is pretty typical. I'm just gonna add a to-do. Hello? And it probably happened a little bit fast. I do have a slowdown here, but before it toggles, you'll see it flash purple for a second before it turns gray. This is showing the optimistic updates. And we can run as many of these as we want in parallel, and race conditions and stuff are automatically handled for us. And this has this kind of nicety here of being able to kind of seamlessly work and handle this mutation story. And obviously, the reason why we get excited about this is if I go into the sources here and do something like this, which is what, disable JavaScript, I refresh the page. You're not going to see those nice optimistic updates anymore. You're going to see the whole page flicker when I update, but obviously this page still works. See, I'm refreshing, showing that it actually saves the data. Still works the way you would expect it to, even without the JavaScript turned on. Right. Sorry, wrong one. It's funny, press Command P in the wrong place, you end up with the print module instead of the panel. Anyways, I've enabled JavaScript again, so we won't mess with ourselves later. And we're back to having our optimistic updates and nice interaction points. And what's cool about this approach is Solid's taken into consider things like that some actions are multi-submit versus single submit. So you might see stuff like up here, create server multi-actions. And this is really powerful because now we get an array. And this means that while the main list is shown as a for loop, while we're pending, we can iterate over that array of pending actions and basically feed that form data back through and draw that optimistic API. And each submission has its own error state, has its own submission state. And this way we can granularly handle errors and submissions and race conditions all kind of automatically with these primitives. Of course, if you don't like using forms, don't care about progressive enhancement, don't worry about it. The add, like this here that's returned, the add to do or remove to do is also just a function you can call. It's just a server function. The form is just kind of nice add-on so we can do progressive enhancement, but you can always just call add to do directly, not use forms, and do everything the way you'd want to otherwise. All right, sorry, this way. So that's all fine and good, but what you might be asking, what about server-centric view of things? Nothing you've seen so far is that different than other frameworks, except maybe a focus on primitives. The fact that you could literally just slide in, solid query from TanStack, and it will work first class with, server functions. Well, I have good news on that front as well. I want to share with something that we've been working on. It's still experimental, but I think it's something that worth getting excited about. I'm going to use a demo app that I'm all too familiar with, Hacker News. Again, this is a classic example. There's a reason why we keep on going to these classics. Hacker News PWA was a site that collected Hacker News implementations in every framework. It's no longer really maintained and most links are dead, but I myself have gone and taken old Vue 2 version and remade it in every framework, pretty much that I can find. And so it's kind of like the perfect example to demo what I want to show here today. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our code, sorry, not that way. And we're going to take a look at our Hacker News example. And this one's a little bit more complicated, but all that happens now is we have three routes. We have a route where we grab all the stories, and you can see we've kind of fetched based on the query parameter, and we create a resource for that, or the user and the individual stories. I'm just going to, I'm just going to build and start this app so we can just look around and you can see what we're dealing with, okay? All right, so done with that, refresh, okay. So here we go, Hacker News example, listing of stories, navigate based on pages, different story types, click into story, see it. There's some comments. These comments are collapsible. So there's minimal interaction with this page. There isn't like heavy mutations like to do MVC, but you can see data fetching patterns. You can see interactivity, and that's why people look at this example. And if you're kind of wondering, like, this is pretty typical kind of scenario for these kind of frameworks. If I refresh the page and look, you'll see the Solid Hacker News examples about 19 kilobytes of JavaScript. To put that in perspective for you, because I've rebuilt this in most frameworks, SvelteKit's about 22 kilobytes. Next is about 80 kilobytes. Remix 74 kilobytes. Just kind of get the range of things. And this is perfectly fine. We made things small, fast, relatively. You could be pretty happy with this. And what you'll see is a pretty typical thing with this is in your framework is you'll see all the, like in Next, I think it's called Next data. You'll see this big blob of JSON, which contains all the story information here for the comments and stuff, so that we can hydrate it, so that we can get that interactivity, so we can collapse those comments. This is pretty typical stuff. I just refresh on this page to make sure I've got everything. Yeah, perfect, right? But what can we do with a server-centric view? How does this change? Well, something that we've been playing with was I worked on Marco at eBay, which I mentioned had these islands, and things like Astro and Fresh have been kind of popularizing them now again, and we wanted to kind of experiment with that. So what we thought was like, okay, cool. Let's just go in here into our config and just go islands true, right? So easy, done. No, not quite. This turns our app into an MPA. But we want that comment toggle to still be interactive. If we just went right now, essentially we just have no JavaScript and nothing would happen. So what we can do is we can break our toggle out from our comment component. So if you just kind of get the flow for this, so you understand, when you load a story, it shows the information about the story. And then it goes through each story and shows all the comments. But each comment recursively can have its own comments in for loops, but they're toggleable. So what we did was we wrapped each branch of comment components, kind of recursive comment and comment, with a toggle component to kind of extract out the state here. So what's a toggle component? Well, it just has a signal, which is Solid's reactivity to open and close it. And then all we do is update some classes based on that signal state. Pretty simple. And then we insert the props children, which is a child list of comments. But now we want this component to be an island. So what we ended up doing, and this API will change. This is experimental right now. Is we're like, okay, well, let's just do this. Const toggle equals unstable island import. Let's import from toggle. So this is, let's just do this. As I said, this is not going to be the final API, but I just want to show now our toggle is imported as an island. And with that and setting it to islands true, we should be able to just build our example again and start. And we're going to see a little bit of a different story happen. When we refresh the page, our comments still collapse. So this all still works. But what you're going to notice is that suddenly we've only got 7 kilobytes of JavaScript. The other 12 disappeared. And actually this page is a little bigger because it has the toggle on it, right? If we navigate over here, you'll see it's actually 6.7 kilobytes of JavaScript, not splitting hairs here. But my point is, what you'll notice is that we're actually reloading the app, the browser, as we navigate around. This is an MPA. This is essentially the Astro style experience. You get small JavaScript, small hydration. And to kind of emphasize that small hydration, that giant script tag that had all the comment data serialization, well, it's gone. All that we have here is this little script for islands map. The reason is we don't need any of this JSON data anymore because it never hydrates. So there's no reason to send it to the client. So not only is there less JavaScript, we remove data duplication, and we just run less code. So this is just win-win-win across the board from that side. So server-centric here showed you the client-centric approach. You can kind of see the worlds kind of combining. All right, sorry, this way. But As cool as that is, to have the ability of MPAs or SPAs that each bring fully optimized for the use case, about a year ago, I realized we could do better. What if we didn't need to choose? I realized that combining 3 existing technologies, we could get it all. And those technologies are nested routing, which, as I said, we've been using for years now, pretty much since Solid was first created. Islands, which I just showed you, and HTML over API, something popularized by turbolinks. But also, thanks to our good friends over at Astro, have been playing with their HMR solution. See, the realization struck that I noticed what happens when we combine these technologies and change the size of our islands. The trick to islands savings is that you only need to serialize the data that's passed down as props, which is why we didn't need to serialize all that comments data, because technically speaking, the only data we needed to, we didn't need to pass that in as props. The toggle component had no props. So typically with this architecture, as you navigate, you'd be just sending, HTML over the wire for the page and the JSON for the props, right? So picture something like what I just showed you, but it server renders each page. But what if the whole nested section, what if the island actually took up the whole page? Well, in that case, we wouldn't need to send any HTML. That's the white part out here. We just need to send the props. In a sense, this approach scales from ultra minimal JavaScript islands with HTML over the wire, kind of, as I said, like an Astro, to a SPA or SPA, sorry, with a JSON API, right? If you look at the extreme cases, there's not really much overhead. There's a small router that you need on the MPA side, but on the single page app side, if you actually treat it like a single page app, your server rendering basically just turns into JSON APIs like you do today. You don't need 2 modes or switch. It's a continuous range. You just use what makes sense for the application. And for me, this was a game changer. So we built it. We were like, okay, let's add a nested router that does server rendering as well. And the cool thing is you just go islands router true. Our current islands already have everything you need, right? You kind of have to attack this from a server-centric view if you want to get the full benefits. But what's cool about this is, look, I'm going to refresh, and yeah, clearly this still works, and clearly we don't need that script tag anymore in serialization. But the difference now is, watch, this is not spinning up. This is full client-side navigation here, right? As we move around, go through these stories, do this stuff, it feels just like the single-page app. Except, can you guess? Ding, ding, ding. We're still only sending 6 kilobytes of JavaScript. It's like the MPA, but the experience of a single page app. And if we looked at the output, we'd see that we're actually swapping out sections of the app and not re-rendering the whole thing. But I think this is actually best exemplified in another app. And if you all check it out at some point, solid-movies.app, we remade the taste movies demo, which is really cool. They have demos in every framework: Next, Angular, Nuxt, Astro, Solid, which is this one, SvelteKit, Lit, Quick. And what's really cool about this demo is we built this on the same technology. You can see all the interaction. You can see this. This feels like a single page app. In fact, you'd be pretty hard to tell the difference between this version. Oh, this one seems to be down. My bad. And I was going to say in the Nuxt version. Okay. But essentially, you can navigate, you can search, you can, what was it, Dragon? Let me see House of Dragons. What you end up with, the input never lost focus, even though we're using this technology. This feels like a single page app, and yet, as we navigate around, I'm going to refresh the page and show you the network. 13.5 kilobytes of JavaScript. It's the experience of a single page app, but without the JavaScript and without the hydration. And I think that's really cool. And just to emphasize how big of a thing this is, those demos I showed you at Taste Movie app navigating around a few pages, this is the kind of size you see: 190 kilobytes, 90 kilobytes for next, 121. Even SvelteKit is about 34 kilobytes, and that's probably where SolidStart would be normally. This approach is just a whole different dimension on reducing size without losing those benefits that we've come to love from single page apps. Anyway, I think that's pretty cool. If you want to get started with SolidStart yourself, you can just run npm and init solid at latest, and you're ready to go. And you'll be on your way to creating the next generation of solid websites and applications. Anyways, like what you heard today, you can find out all the resources you need off solidjs.com. You can find me on Twitter. And if you really like nerding out on JS frameworks and the future of JavaScript, I stream weekly on YouTube and Twitch. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Oh my gosh, that you got my mind spinning. I'm not sure I 100% got everything, but I'm impressed by what I saw. So I got some questions, but I think some folks in the audience, I'm sure, must have questions. So one question from the audience was SolidStart v1 and stable items. When do you expect these to be fully released?
Yeah, and those are two different initiatives. I'm going to be clear. V1, in my scope of things, at least today, I don't want to pull the island stuff in because I don't want to delay it further than it needs to. Right now, the state of V1 is we have most of the APIs, and the beta launch right now, we're working on stabilization. This is just the part where we're working with all the adapters. That's where we're having the pain. This doesn't work on Vercel. This doesn't work on Netlify, and we're just going through how do you do this in Cloudflare? So I'm not going to make any promises here. If you've seen any of the other meta frameworks, this stuff takes a long time, and every time someone tries to make a promise here, they're usually months off. So I'm not going to give that to you, unfortunately. Right now, we are just going through a stabilization period, and I'm hoping that it will not take too long. But it really comes down to how much feedback and how much we can work through stuff with the community.
Sure, makes sense. And so, just to clarify, because I haven't tried Solid yet, or obviously SolidStart's new. So, is SolidStart is it fully SSR, kind of like a remix model, or is it some combo like Astro's, especially now with Astro 2 can mix static and SSR? So you're fully SSR, right?
Yeah, there's a static adapter. The funny thing about these libraries is that a lot of them can do a lot of the same things, but they're kind of pre-configured to work a certain way, right? The Astro is an MPA framework, and it's really good set up for static, but you could always stick a full single page app on an Astro page if you want to. Solid is much more on the SvelteKit remix side of things, where it's kind of configured to set up to build applications. And in our case, like SvelteKit, we have the option to say, hey, let's do a static page or whatnot. But I'd say we're more on the SvelteKit remix side of things.
Okay, that makes sense. So it can do static, but it's probably a all or nothing, I'm assuming, or?
Yeah, that's generally the approach we've taken to date. We have talked about doing it on a per page level, but as you can see, I'm very interested on how things can scale without having modes or switches, just simply on what you write. So I will say for V1, it will be just per page level, kind of similar to SvelteKit.
Okay, that makes sense. So let me ask you, this approach you talked about at the end, and where it's kind of the feel of an SPA, but the benefit of an MPA in terms of how it's rendered and stuff. Is this an approach you think is kind of something can be universally applied, or are there specific scenarios where this works or it doesn't work? Or is that something you're still experimenting?
My hope is that this can be universally applied, and obviously even working beyond frameworks like Solid. It's a tricky thing. My biggest concern right now is actually developer experience concerns. I think that it's hard to know the boundaries between server and client if it's not handled right. And when you're I showed in this example, I literally switch the modes by just like toggling a switch or like changing something, and all the existing code works. That seems really good in theory, but it gets confusing as you scale things. So that's the largest reason why I've kept that in experimental, because I think the place we need to figure out next for this is how to make that experience really feel natural and not confusing. But yeah, so that's kind of why it's where it is, if that makes any sense. But in general, I'm very hopeful, as I was pointing out, that this actually scales across the whole spectrum. There's a little bit of overhead that comes with doing it over a pure MPA islands approach, but it's like fractions of kilobytes, so to speak. Like it's not a huge thing on size. There is some consideration that certain types of components now become islands that wouldn't before, things like anchors, because you need to, update the style of like an anchor selected, where in MPA you wouldn't need that. So there are considerations, but I think that like it covers the 90% range so well that this could be the future.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And you're getting a lot of like, yeah, people understand the DX concerns. I know for myself, like even from a simplistic standpoint, like I mean, I'm often like, this isn't working, and I'm looking for the error in the wrong place, and it's because that's right, that one's on the server, not on the client. And it's not always like that obvious where that script is running.
Yeah.
So I totally get that.
Yeah, and this is going to be something that we have to consider across the whole ecosystem for the next couple of years. Like, this is the challenge on the DX side for everything. Honestly, you're suddenly like aware of certain. It's not just the boundaries of where the code runs, but boundaries on data serialization. Like what needs to be serializable over the wire and what doesn't. You could try and hide that, but then you're going to get hit some point. And I think that has now kind of entered our mindset, and we need to figure out a way to combat this complexity, or otherwise developers are not going to adopt this.
Makes sense. And are you all exploring like, because I know one of the things Remix pushes is like, okay, we do a lot of this rendering at the edge kind of thing. Is that, I mean, I'm assuming this would be entirely possible with this.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even talk about this. SolidStart started on the edge. We made our first demo on Cloudflare Workers March 2021 with streaming from the edge. If you've recently seen that defer feature that Remix has, that's something that we've had with SolidStart right from the creation. That was like offset. This is how one of the things that Marco introduced back in 2014, and I immediately was like, yes, we need out of order streaming. We need to be able to deploy it to the edge. So yeah, as of today, Solid supports edge on Cloudflare, on Netlify, on Vercel. If people follow me, I've been jumping in on that. When Vercel released Next 12 a year ago, within 24 hours, we had streaming SolidStart on the edge. That's what I'm all about here.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I mean, here we are at what's basically a Jamstack conference, right? And I was thinking back, like, it wasn't too long ago we were really dealing almost entirely in static with like some client side, interactivity and maybe some hydration. But like, seems like now we're moving. A lot of frameworks are moving to where it's only an SSR solution. I know Enhanced, which will be talked about later today. That's their approach as well, and kind of something they've pushed as. I mean, do you think is that where you think this is headed in general? Like we've now dropped like, okay, there's not a lot of benefit to pushing stuff, to pre-rendering stuff. Like we're just going to go with server rendering.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge because there's two things going on. We obviously the interactivity and the expectations of interactivity in our applications have gone up over time, and as a result, single page apps have gotten bigger and bigger and more bloated, and that's been the whole problem. And no one wants to sacrifice that. At the same time, we all recognize, as I was mentioning, like if you build with that mentality, you're just going to have you're going to pull the whole internet onto your web page, and we know that we have to delegate more to the server and we have to change that balance. That's what we've been doing. But now you've got this push happening on both sides, right? Because those complicated front ends are like, no, server, do more stuff. Like something has to give. And the timing with edge functions is just great because now we're bringing that processing, closer to the end user. And I think that this is why you're seeing it. It's just like some of that demand and expectation that we were like, it's okay, we can do that in the browser. We're like saying, no, it's not okay. Don't do that in the browser. So it's just natural that you're going to have more stuff running on these serverless environments compared to, maybe a couple years ago. That being said, this is why the Netlifys and Vercells and everyone in the world are so focused on caching solutions and stuff at the edge, because there's still a cost going back to your data centers. This whole world is now, instead of looking at a CDN as a single, like here's your static files, it's looking at even parts of individual pages as like static chunks that can be stitched together. That's the world we're kind of heading into.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think, it becomes really difficult to even like think about this mentally when you're like, some things are rendering, where is my rendering happening? Where is my data coming from? Where's like, and how much, this is where I get into like the edges. I'm a firm believer in the edge, but it's like adds a whole layer of complexity to your application development when you're thinking about like when you're trying to think about, okay, it doesn't immediately solve latency if I'm then having to go back 3 times to my server to get data kind of thing,
It's amusing to me, and I'll explain why if I got a second. It's that the rise of single page apps came up around the same times in the rise of microservices, and wanted to get to like stateless, and these things aligned, and that kind of like really went hand in hand. And now we're seeing a return. People are like, oh, that's too complicated, I need monoliths. But we know that we still need to solve the distribution problem, so to speak. So my expectation here is you're going to see more and more tooling that lets people author as monoliths, but then handles the distribution details in the background for them, semi-automated or half manual or whatever. But that's where you're going to see the development in this space, because as I said, the pressure is kind of pushing from all sides, and it's getting kind of compressed right around these serverless and edge technologies.
Yeah, and I'd say like the last thing I mentioned, not really a question, it's just like I think it's funny because I've been doing this super long time, like 20-something years, and I've gone from like, okay, we're doing everything on the server to no, let's push everything to the client, and it's like, no, this is not working, let's push it back to the server and back to the client. So it's just like a continuous continuum, as of back and forth as technologies change, and we adjust our expectations. But anyway, it's kind of fun. It's fun to watch.
Yeah, hot potato, who's left holding the bag? I don't know. It's some of it. We take it on by choice because new opportunities always emerge every time we move this around. So yeah, I mean, I think it's exciting because each iteration gets a little bit better, gets a little bit more, nuanced, gets a little bit more powerful, and of course that opens up new possibilities, which send us back to the drawing board a few years later. So yeah, it's really exciting to see this evolve over time. As myself, also a very long time person in web dev.